Nation, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and we are back in an episode of Cheap Shots. This is the series that is dedicated to showing you, the miniature wargamer, how to save money on the miniatures wargaming hobby. And on today's episode number 74, we're going to show you guys how to cheaply and quickly paint up biased referees for Games Workshop's Blood Bowl. And as you can see here in the picture right in front of you, this is what the end result will look like. And by using the techniques as well as materials that we suggest, you can create a beautiful tabletop standard for both of your biased referees using our cheapskate method, costing you only $29.72. Now, when you compare that with the materials that you need to purchase from Citadel as well as Army Painter, that's going to cost you $200.59 in order to do it that way. And when you compare it to methods, we're giving you a grand total savings of $170.87. So that being said, ladies and gentlemen, let's go ahead and teach you guys how to quickly and more importantly cheaply paint up your pair of bias referees for Blood Bowl. So the very first thing, of course, you have to do is assemble your miniatures, and once your miniatures are assembled and fully based, the next thing we're going to do now is do a quick texture on the base that these players are standing on. Texturing the bases actually adds a really nice characteristic and some additional detail to your miniatures. And for us, the method that we like to use for the cheapskate method is a simple Elmer's wood glue, sand, as well as water combination. All we do is that we actually cover the bases that we want covered and textured with wood glue, and then we dust it with some sand that we get from outside in my backyard, and then we let that dry. And once that's done, of course, what we do is we take some Elmer's wood glue, mix it with a 50-50 mixture with regular tap water until it makes it a little bit of a slurry that's about the consistency of milk, and then you just take that and just dab it on top of the sand, so that way it creates a nice sealant, airtight, at the same time has a beautiful texturing on your bases. And that, of course, is all free because these are things that we just have kind of laying around the house for the most part. Now, when it comes to Games Workshop, of course, you'll need to purchase Astrogranite, which is a texture paint, which costs us $7.80. And right off the bat, we are saving you $7.80 by just doing a really quick, simple, cheapskate basing. So from there, the next thing we need to do, of course, is once our base is dry and cured, the next thing you do, of course, is primer miniatures. In this case, I like to use Rust-Oleum Flat White Primer. I can get this stuff at my local Walmart for $3.99, and all I do is I just do a quick once over with my flat white primer to make sure that the miniature is fully covered. Now, priming is an important step for painting your miniature because it does a couple of things. First of all, the primer actually adds a nice texturing to your smooth plastic miniatures, which gives a nice uneven rough surface for your acrylic paints to adhere to. If you're actually just to paint your miniatures on bare plastic, the paint would actually slowly rub off of your miniatures and ruin your finish. So because of that, priming is a very important step on this one. Now, traditionally, when it comes to primers, there's pretty much one school of thought on priming. When you use 3 different types of colors to prime your miniatures, you can use white, which I'm doing in this situation, which is a good idea to use, especially if you want to work with really bright and vibrant color schemes on your miniatures. You have gray, which is a nice medium mid-tone, which basically just kind of acts as a neutral base for your miniatures. And of course, you also have black, which is really good to use for metallics as well as for more subdued and darker color tones. So because we're using a quick paint method to paint up these miniatures involving an oil wash, it's going to really subdue the value of our colors. So because I like to use flat white primer on this step. Now, if you were to purchase your materials from Games Workshop, you'll need to buy a rattle can of Corax white spray. It's going to cost you $17, and so far that's going to bring up your total to $24.80 by using Games Workshop and Army Painter products, whereas for the cheapskate method, we're starting off at $3.99, with our total savings up to this point at to $20.81 at this point. So once we're done with our priming, the next thing we need to do, of course, is to start doing some painting on the flesh tones. In this case, I use Delta Ceram Coat Peaches and Cream, which is a nice pale flesh color. I use that for my elf bias referee because elves are traditionally lighter skinned. And I used Apple Barrel's Nutmeg Brown, which cost me 50 cents at my local Walmart, and I use that for the Dwarf right next to it at the same time. You just go to put 2 thin layers on this stuff all over your miniatures, so that way they have a good base coat to work off when it comes to flesh. And of course, to buy these 2 products, it costs me $1.15, which brings our ground total so far to $5.14 for the cheapskate method. Now, if you're to use materials from Games Workshop, you need to buy Flayed One Flesh for the Elf as well as Bugman's Glow for the Dwarf. Both those products cost $4.55 for a grand total of $9.10. And of course, you're going to start spending up to $33.90 to use items from Games Workshop as well as from Army Painter. It should be noted, at this stage right now, the Games Workshop as well as Citadel as well as the Army Painter method has just broken through what we're going to be paying for the entire cost of painting up these miniatures. And we're just on the base coats with the flesh right now. So our total savings that we're giving you guys right now is $28.76. So our next step is to focus on the Dwarf character. This time we're going to do a quick dry brush using Apple Barrel's Flesh. That's going to cost you 50 cents at your local Walmart, which brings our grand total for a cheapskate method of $5.64. Now we are going to do a heavy dry brush with this flesh tone on top of the Dwarf. And the reason why is because you want that darker skin tone to stay in the recesses of the miniature as well. Now, dry brushing is actually a very important step on miniatures war painting, and the reason why is because when you paint your miniatures using dry brushing, what it does is that the pigments of the paint actually catch upon the raised surfaces of the miniature, which allows you to create highlighting as well as the illusion of depth on your miniature as well. And the reason why is because a darker color stays in the recesses of the miniature, so you have that nice three-dimensional look to your miniature. Now, if you're to use Citadel paint, you'll need to buy a pot of Cadian Flesh Tone, which costs you $4.55, and that also nets your grand total to $38.45 using Games Workshop as well as Army Painter products. And when combined with our cheapskate method, we're so far saving you $32.81. So now that we're done with the flesh portions, what we're doing now is start working on the clothing for these miniatures. In this case, we're using Anita's Acrylic True Red, which costs 65 cents at your local Hobby Lobby. And grand total so far for our cheapskate method is $6.29. Now we're going to use this for both the card that the elf player is carrying as well as the t-shirt that the elf player is also wearing as red. Well, we put 2 thin layers of this material onto the miniature, so that way we have a good solid base coat for all the red clothing and the red colors on the miniature as well. Now, if you wanted to use the Citadel equivalent, you need to buy a pot of Mephiston Red, which costs you $4.55, and that brings your Games Workshop Army Painter total to $43 even. And right now, our cheapskate method is saving you $36.71 at this stage of the painting. Now that we're done with the undercoating for the elf, the next thing we do now is start working on the overcoats for both players, for both the Dwarf Bias referee as well as the elf referee. Now for the uniforms in this one, we're actually going to paint their clothing in Apple Barrel Pavement, which costs you 50 cents. You can get this at your local Walmart. And so for our grand total for our cheapskate method is $6.79. Pavement is actually a very, very, very dark gray, almost to the point of being black. However, it is not an absolute black color. At the same time, the pavement paint also has a nice little gritty texture to it, which is perfect for dry brushing details later on. So because I put 2 thin coats on this all over the clothing and being sure you're careful around the different colors you use for both the flesh as well as for the red shirt for the elf player. Now, if you use the Citadel method, you would have to buy a pot of Eshin Gray, which costs you $4.55, and your grand total so far from Army Painter and Games Workshop is at $47.55. And at this stage, we are actually saving you $40.76 using the cheapskate method. So now that we're done with the base coating of the clothing, next we do too, of course, is a quick dry brush. In this case, we're using Anita's Acrylic Gray, which costs you 65 cents at your local Hobby Lobby, and that brings your total cheapskate method up to $7.44. All we're going to do is just a quick dry brush all over the black clothing that we did in pavement earlier, and as you can see, that gray does a beautiful job catching upon the raised surfaces and showing the folds of the fabric that the players are wearing. Now, if you wanted to use the same product from Citadel, you need to buy a pot of Slanesh Gray. That's going to cost you $4.55 from that line, giving you a grand total of $52.10. And when you look at the savings that we're doing with our cheapskate method, we are saving you $44.66 at this point of the painting process. So the last thing we do with this clothing, of course, is do one more additional dry brush, this time using Folk Arts Pale Gray, which costs you 75 cents at your local Walmart, and that brings our cheapskate total to $8.19 up to this point. Now, the reason why we're doing an additional dry brush, the Pale Gray, so that way we get one additional layer of highlighting on top of the black clothing. It's actually a really nice process that reacts very well with the oil washing stage, and it actually has a really nice looking three-dimensionality to the miniatures as well, so that's why I like to put that additional lighter shade of gray on the dry brushing as well. Now, if you want to use the same equivalent color from Citadel, you need to buy a pot of Ulthuan Gray, which costs you $4.55, and your Games Workshop Army Painter total so far is at $56.65, and our cheapskate method is actually saving you $48.46 at this point. So next thing we're working on now is on the hair for both the elf as well as for the Dwarf. I do apologize for the blurriness of this photo. It looks like my camera is actually focused on the background rather than the foreground, so I do apologize for that. Now, for the hair for the elf, we're going to use Apple Barrel's King's Gold, and for the Dwarf there on the right hand side, we're going to use Ripe Tomato by Apple Barrel Paint as well. Now, both those products cost 50 cents at your local Walmart, costing you $1 in total, which brings our current cheapskate method up to $9.19. And all I do is I take those 2 colors, just put 2 thin layers on all the hair that I want painted for these characters in these colors. Now, if you want to use the same equivalent colors from Games Workshop, you'll need to buy Everland Sunset as well as Troll Slayer Orange. Both those pots cost you $4.55 a piece for a grand total of $9.10. And when you combine that with all the materials you've purchased from Army Painter as well as Games Workshop at this point, Your total investment's at $65.75. And then, of course, right now we're saving you $56.56 at this stage of the painting process. So right off the bat, you're probably paying more now for these two miniatures, for this paint job, than you have on those two miniatures if you use products from Citadel as well as from Army Painter. So from there, we're now moving on to the dry brush for the hair that we just did, and for the yellow hair, we're going to use for the orange hair, we're going to use Apple Barrel's Tropic Orange, and for the yellow hair, we're using Sunny Day by Apple Barrel Paint as well. Both those products can be purchased at Walmart for 50 cents a piece, and giving you a grand total of $1 in order to use these two dry brushing colors. That brings up our cheapskate method up to $10.19 so far. As you can see, we just do a quick dry brush on all the hair with the orange as well as with the Sunny Day. So that way we have that nice sense of, you can see the individual fibers of the hair and also create some depth to your miniature as well. Now, if you want to use the equivalent colors from Citadel, you need to purchase a pot of Luganeth Orange and Hexos Pale Sun. Both those run you $4.55 a pot, which brings your grand total to $9.10. And when you combine that with the money you've spent so far from Citadel as well as Army Painter to paint up these guys, you're talking about a grand total of $65.66, which is actually the cost of a normal squad box set for either Age of Sigmar or for Warhammer 40,000. And so far, our cheapskate method is saving you $55.47 at this point. So now we're moving on to the small little details on these miniatures, specifically working on the pages of the book that's on the back of the hips of the dwarf, as well as the large piece of parchment that the elf is carrying as well. Now to pick up those details, we're using Anita's acrylic taupe gray, which costs us 65 cents at your local Hobby Lobby, and that increases our cheapskate total by $9.75 at this point. Now, from Citadel Army Painter, you'll need to buy Ratkarth Flesh, which costs you $4.55, which means that your grand total from Games Workshop is at $60.02, and so far we're saving you $50.27. All you gotta do is put two thin layers of Anita's acrylic taupe gray upon the pages of the book as well as the parchment to get a good solid base coat, and now we're going to be focusing on the details for both of these referees. So, starting off with the elf player, what we're going to do now is we're going to focus on the giant quill that the elf is using. For this color, we're going to use Apple Barrel's Burnt Umber, which costs you 50 cents at your local Walmart, which gives us a grand total of $10.25 for our cheapskate method. And all we're going to do is we're going to take the Burnt Umber, put two thin layers of that color all over the quill of the feather, so that we have a good solid base coat to work off of for additional details later on. Now, if you want to do exactly the same thing from Citadel, you need to buy a pot of wild wood, which costs you $7.80, which brings your grand total from those guys up to $67.82. And our total savings right now with our cheapskate method is saving you $57.57 at this stage. Our next detail will be primarily focused on the dwarf in this case. In this situation, we're actually focusing on all the different books that this character is carrying. He's actually carrying 4 different books on his person. So because that, we're going to be using different colors for each of the different book covers. We're using Delta Serum Coat Tahitian Blue. We're also using Apple Barrel's Holly Branch, Apple Barrel Bright Blue. And all those 3 products, when combined together, will cost you $1.65. 50 cents for the 2 Apple Barrel paints and 65 cents for the Delta Serum Coat. Now, when you combine that with our cheapskate method so far, you're talking about a grand total investment of $11.90 so far. Now, we're just going to put 2 thin layers of these different colors of paint upon the book covers that are on the back as well as the hips of the dwarf player. Now, you can put them in any kind of degree that you like in terms of brightness or whatever colors you want. It's entirely up to you, but that's exactly what we did for this one to create the illusion this guy is carrying multiple manuals and rule books with him as he's basically refereeing the game. Now, if you want to use exactly the same colors from Games Workshop, you'll need to buy Baharoth Blue, Caliban Green, and Teclis Blue. All those colors will run you $4.55 in total, bringing your grand total of $13.65 from that. And when you combine with the other products you bought from Citadel and Army Painter, you're talking about a grand total investment of $81.47. And when you compare that with our cheapskate method, we are saving you $69.57 at this stage. Alright, next we're going to work on now on the leather goods for both these players. We'll be using 2 coats of base coat as well as a dry brushing using Territorial Beige from Apple Barrel Paint, which costs you 50 cents at your local Walmart. And that brings your cheapskate total up to $12.40 as well. So in this situation where things are covering are things like the belts that these players are carrying as well as the binding of the books on the back of the dwarf. We're also using this on the shoes that both players are wearing as well. And lastly, we're also doing a quick dry brush with Territorial Beige on top of the quill that the elf referee is actually carrying. Now, if you want to use the same color from Games Workshop, you need to use Baylor Brown, which costs you $4.55 for that one. And your Games Workshop / Army Painter total so far is at $86.02. And when compared with our cheapskate method, we are saving you $73 as well as 62 cents at this point. So at this next stage, we're also doing some more base coats, this time doing the finer details for both the dwarf player as well as for the elf player. Now for the dwarf player, we're using Bright Magenta, which costs you 50 cents at your local Walmart, made by Apple Barrel Paint, bringing our grand total for Cheapskate method at $12.90. And what we're using that for is the small little ink quill that he has strapped to the back of the book that is on the back of the Dwarf. Now, of course, you'll need to purchase Screamer Pink from Games Workshop if you want to do exactly the same thing. That's costing you $4.55 from them, and that brings your grand total to $90.57. And so far, we're saving you $70.67 at this point. Now, as for the elf player, what we're going to do now is also do some additional details on the quill that player is carrying. The first thing we use is pale gray to create some white strips along the top of the feather, and then we use also Pavement by Apple Barrel Paint as well for the very tip of the feather. So that way the feather on the quill looks like something from an ostrich or something, to give that additional detail as well. And once we're done with those detail pieces, next thing we're working on now are the metallics. Alright, so for this next stage, we're working on the metallic colors on the miniature as well. In this situation, for all the gold elements on these miniatures, we're using Deco Arts Emperor's Gold, which you can get at Walmart for your local Walmart for 75 cents for that one. Now, for all the parts are done in silver, things like the padlocks, the tip of the quill, as well as some of the chains and links going on these miniatures, we're using Folk Arts Gunmetal Gray, which also costs you 75 cents at local Walmart for that color. And then, of course, for all the copper pieces, like the little tub of ink that's hanging out the back of the book, that's on the Dwarf's back, that's going to cost you 75 cents as well. Now, when you combine it all together, it's going to cost you $2.25 at your local Walmart for these three metallic colors, which brings our Cheapskate method to a grand total of $15.15 at this point. Now, all we're going to do, of course, is pick out all those metallic elements in Gunmetal Gray, Copper, and Emperor's Gold, and we just put 2 thin layers of those paints on the miniature. Now, if you wanted to use the same exact colors from Games Workshop, you'll need to buy Retributor Armor, Lead Belcher, as well as Screaming Bell. All those colors cost you $7.80 a piece, for a grand total of $23.40. And when you combine that with all the materials you need to purchase from Games Workshop to paint this way, you're talking about a grand total investment of $113.97, which means you're spending 3 times as much money to paint these miniatures as you paid for them, which kind of tells you how ridiculous those prices really are. And when you combine our Cheapskate method, we are totally giving you a total savings of $98.82 at this stage. So the last little detail we're going to paint on these miniatures before we move on, of course, is a base coat. This time we're using on the gem that's being used by the elf player right there in the middle of his belt buckle. For that, we're using Tahitian blue. Once again, just putting 2 thin layers on that little gemstone, put 2 little dots on it. And once we're done with that step, we're pretty much done with these miniatures. So now that we're done doing the base coat, next thing we do now is an oil wash. So in this stage, we're going to do a quick oil wash using Minwax Polyshade Acrylic, and we're going to use that and paint it all over the entirety of our miniatures as well for our wash. Now, the Minwax Polyshade Mission Oak color costs us $6.99 at your local Walmart, and that brings us to a grand total of $22.14 being spent so far. Now, the reason why we're using Minwax Polyshade is because what the oil wash actually does, it does a couple of things. The first thing that it does, of course, is it blends the layers of our base coating as well as our dry brushing that we've done in our miniatures so far. If you guys notice in our pictures between our base coats and dry brushing, our miniatures had a very uneven, kind of rough looking, chalky kind of texture to them. And the reason why is because that's the natural process of what happens when you oil wash your miniatures. Now, of course, to solve that problem, you do a quick wash real fast when using oil washing, and what that does, that blends your colors together to smooth out those transitions between highlights as well as base coats, and at the same time kind of make those colors kind of smooth out in the transitions. Now, the next thing that, of course, that it does as well is that oil washing also seeps into the recesses of the miniature as well, bringing a lot of the details that we couldn't see before with our base coating as well as our dry brushing. Now, that's the nice part about that. It kind of brings all those details together as well. Now, when you paint up your miniature using your poly shades, I would suggest that you do this as the last stage of your painting process, because you need to let these miniatures dry for at least 24 hours for it to dry as well as cure. Now, the reason why that's the case is because polyurethane is located in the poly shade, so what's going to happen is that after it dries, it's going to leave a nice clear coat protective layer on your miniature as well. So because I gotta let it cure for 24 hours to do so. Otherwise, if you try to handle your miniature while it's still tacky, you could potentially ruin the finish of your miniature, and then you have to start all over again. Now, a lot of people like to use Armor Painter Strong Tone in order to do this step, which costs you $32 a can. And there's nothing wrong with that. Army Painter is a perfectly good product. It does exactly as advertised. The only problem, though, is it's $32, which is almost, 5 times as much as the Minwax Poly Shades. And when you combine that with all the other materials you purchase from Games Workshop from their Citadel paint line, you're talking about a grand total investment of $145.97. That's the cost of most starter box sets for most miniatures war games, being spent on just paint for the most part. And at the same time, we're also saving you $123.83 at this point. So once the miniature is done drying as well as curing, the next thing we need to now start working on the bases of this miniature. So in this case, I like to use burnt umber for apple barrel paint. We've used this earlier in our painting process. I just put 2 thin layers on top of the texturing on top of the bases to kind of give it kind of like a muddy, kind of dirty kind of look for the base as well. Now, if you're worried about the white undercoat peeking through the burnt umber, I would not worry about that. And the reason why is because we're doing dry brush anyways, so that's going to solve our problems. So all I got to do is put 2 thin layers of burnt umber on the bases, and then we move on to our dry brush. So at this stage, I like to use Territorial Beige and do a quick little dry brush on top of the texturing of the bases. This is the same paint that we used earlier in our painting process. And once again, does a really nice job of bringing out those highlights on those details on the bases that we had earlier, which is absolutely fantastic. And once we get done with the dry brush, the next thing we do now is a spray varnish. Now I should mention that this step is actually optional. So if you like to have that nice bright coated, candy coated sheen on your miniatures, you could of course skip this stage. However, for me though, I like my miniatures to be a little bit more matted, so that way you can see a lot more of the details, that way it's not being blocked by the light. So in this situation, I like to use Krylon Matte Varnish Spray. I can get this at my local Walmart for $5.99, and that brings our cheapskate total up to $28.13 so far. I just do a quick dusting real quick with the spray varnish and let it dry, so that way it meets down the sheen from the oil wash. As you can see, all those beautiful details that we couldn't see earlier are now coming up on the surface. Now if you want to do exactly the same thing from Games Workshop, and you buy Mutatorium Varnish, which costs you $19.50, which means your grand total right now investment is $165.47 from Games Workshop and Army Painter. And our cheapskate method right now is saving you $137.34. So right after that, the next thing we do now is to flock our miniatures. In this case, what I like to use is homemade flock, which I get for free. My buddy Iron Major actually has a bunch of homemade flock that he made out of sawdust that he dyed with acrylic paint. So he gave me a little, carton full of that stuff, so that I can use for my miniatures as well. All I do is I just take some wood glue, put it on the bases where I want flocking to be, dust them real quick with the homemade flock. So since it's free, we're still at our $28.13 so far for our total investment using our cheapskate method. Now, if we were to use Army Painter, we have to use Army Painter Basing Set, which basically contains flock for your miniatures, and that costs $18.99 with that. When combined with everything else that you purchase from Army Painter as well as Games Workshop, you're talking about a grand total investment of $184.46 to paint up these 2 miniatures, which should tell you something about how expensive those materials are. At the same time, our cheapskate method is saving you $156.33 at this point. And for our very last step, the last thing we do, of course, is to paint the rims of the bases. In this case, I use Apple Barrel Palm Green, which costs me 50 cents at my local Walmart, bringing our grand total for our cheapskate method to $28.63 at this point. I put three thin layers of this paint along the rims of the bases. Now, the reason why I put 3 on there is because I really want to create that cartoony, rich green color around the rims of the bases, which is something I grew up with as a kid, looking at classic editions of Blood Bowl, how the miniatures look with their bases. Kind of nostalgic for us. That's the reason why I do that, to make that really strong palm leaf green look around the rims of the bases. Now, if you want to do exactly the same thing from Games Workshop, you need to buy a pot of Militarum Green, which costs you $4.55, which brings your grand total from Games Workshop to $189.01 for 2 miniatures. You're spending close to $200 to paint up 2 miniatures at this point. And our grand total savings right now for our cheapskate method is $160.38. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. This is what the end result of your miniatures would look like for the cheapskate method, using the materials that we suggest, and assuming you're purchasing all those materials for the very first time. You're talking about a grand total investment of $28.63 to paint up your 2 bias refs the same way we did. Now, if you were to, on the flip side, to purchase your materials from Games Workshop as well as Army Painter, you're talking about a grand total of $189.01 just to paint up 2 miniatures. That's basically a starter box set of Age of Sigmar, 40k, or Necromunda at this point. You're spending that much money on paint to paint 2 miniatures, but you could use that money to buy huge box sets of miniatures instead. And if you want to know what the total savings on this one's going to be, it's $160.38. So as needless to say, the cheapskate method looks just as good as the Games Workshop and Army Painter method, except ours is a heck of a lot cheaper. In fact, that's like, 9 times less almost than the other stuff. So that kind of tells you something about that. So that's good for you guys. As always, please feel free to like, comment, and or subscribe. Your guys' input is invaluable to us as always. Also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, as well as blogger.com for all the latest greatest hobby news related to this channel. That's good for this week, guys. We'll catch you guys next one. Peace out and stay classy.